me honest here. So the folks are here. Okay, we just started class talking about picking a topic. So anybody else need some help with that? Are we feeling okay? I'll assume the quietness means everyone's on it. They're like crushing it. We got this. All right. We finished the TED Talk. We finished the lecture. We finished lecture 3. Did we finish the lecture?
Yeah.
Maybe. We did. Okay, thank you, Eliza. All right, so we're gonna move on to lecture 4, and let me find it here, which is about ethics. And this will be especially salient with what's going on here. Let's see, swap. There we go. What's going on today with vaccination. So we'll talk about several seminal research or studies that have taken place in the past and how they have really shaped ethics that we're currently using. So in other words, there were many studies done in the past that showed just gross ethical negligence towards participants in disclosing what the study was about. And because of that incredible negligence and errors that were made towards participant, it led to reform in how we now do research, right? So all good things. But having said that, we did not arrive to this point of having an ethical guideline because researchers were like, well, we should really do that. It really stemmed out of really terrible research. Gosh, the shadows are going to be super obnoxious. Okay, I need to just stand this far back. If all of a sudden it looks like I'm in the dark, I'm not. I'm just, actually now I'm directly behind a bird feeder. So in a minute, I'm not going to be. Anyway, the way this relates now, right, is there's still ongoing research that's happening, medical research, right? I'm interested to get the conversation going as to what do you think might be some hesitance or concerns that the general populace may have in regards to new medicine, new procedures, new research, and why might that be? Just opening it up broad.
Well, I would say one of the first things people would be worried about are the side effects.
Okay. Because there's been evidence of new medications that have significant side effects, and so that's weighing the pros and cons. Okay. What might be something else that gives somebody pause or might make them feel like they hesitate before they trust what a medical professional or a study leader might suggest for them?
Not even just like side effects, but like long-term effects. Like if they don't know what happens if after you've been on it for a long time, which could be more like you've been on it for a long time, so there's not a lot of going back. But if you recently had it, you could stop it right away if there's side effects shown, right?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. So there's some medications that are brand new, right? And they're like, it is shown to do really well at treating symptom X. But they don't, in those trials, how long did they have to test it out on those people to see if there's long-term effects, right? That's always a question. There's actually an article posted on NPR this morning about some hesitation with the COVID vaccine further south in really more rural, less affluent, and more ethnically diverse areas. And they actually cited one of the studies we'll talk about today as one of the reasons why they're more hesitant, because there has historically been kind of a lack of clarity, at times even just flat out lies in order to propel research forward. So have you guys heard about this is maybe like a side tangent, but are you aware that there's been research done on people without their consent or them knowing the impact of the effects? Is that something that you're like, yep, I kind of in my head, I know this happened?
Wait, are you asking for like a specific like research study?
No, just in general, knowing that that's happened.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I think most often when we start this discussion, people are like, oh, World War II, right? Tons of research done without people being aware. But it's easy to push this off, and we'll talk about that in multiple studies that have taken place a long time ago and go, well, that was then, it is not now. Is that how we're feeling? It's then and we've changed everything and now that would never happen?
No, I would say there's still a lot of places, especially around the world in less developed countries, that people are utilized for the profit of companies or for people who don't want to go through the proper channels of research. So I'd say it still is very pertinent.
Yeah. I think this is the main take home that I want all of you to recognize is that we will talk about a lot of old studies and we'll talk about how ethics have, and research has shown great reform. But let's not then say, well, that was a then issue. We've clearly evolved and none of this is happening now and everyone is always treated fairly in research. That is also a false statement. It would be like studying racism and go, oh, well, those were issues of the past. Clearly, everything's fine now, right? When we look at the past, it's easy to then put blinders on the current situation. And I just would stretch all of you guys to recognize that it's not because we talk about it in the past that it's not happening now. Okay. It's my little soapbox moment to make sure everybody stays on it. All right. So today we're going to talk about some of these historical examples. We're going to talk about the current core ethical principles that have to happen for sound research and what's been done to create safer guidelines in performing research, especially on human participants. One of those is you guys having to complete that certification, right? So any participant needs to do that. Anyone who's going to participate in a study as a researcher or principal researcher needs to go through that certification. And then we'll talk about ethical decision making. And this will be tricky. And it's, again, we're going to use several examples in this section on ethics. And I want you guys to take this as an opportunity to look at it also philosophically. Like, do you knowingly cause harm to a few because it'll be for the greater good? Like, have you guys taken philosophy classes and done the railway experiment? Like, do you switch the railway so that a train hits one person and you knowingly are like, you're making it change path so it will kill that one person? Or do you let it go and it kills everybody in the train, which is like 10 people, right? So those kinds of ethical decisions that there's almost like no win, right? Like it's neither sounds good. A lot about medical research is like that because you are trying to push things forward to find a solution, but it may cause harm in the process. So, okay. Let's dive in. So, the Tuskegee syphilis study. This is one of the major ones we will talk about that took place from 1932 all the way to 1972. And that specific study really highlights three of the major ethical violations that were then fought against as there was reform in research. The next one we'll talk about is the Milgram obedience study, which shows, again, an ethical issue and how that's addressed in the future. Now, just quickly, have you guys heard about both of these? Or are you like, nope, never heard of either of those names? A little bit, maybe. Hopefully Milgram is something you guys have talked about, maybe in like intro to psych class. So yeah, we'll dive in a little bit more on that one. Okay, so let's start with the Tuskegee study. So during the 30s, right, like earlier in late 20s, there were a lot of issues with men contracting syphilis and then dying, right? So this was turning into an issue. So again, syphilis is still common, but there's ways to treat it now so that it's not deadly. Researchers at the time were trying to find a way to treat it and to prevent its spread. And so they thought, let us test it on a group of individuals to see the length and kind of the path of the disease. Okay. So for instance, if somebody has a cold, you know what symptoms to expect, right? What would be some symptoms to expect with a cold?
Stuffy nose.
Okay. What else?
Coughs.
Cough. Maybe you get a fever. Maybe you're like so stuffed up you can't really smell, right? We have seen enough cases of the cold that we can map out the symptoms pretty accurately. Now let's take out a newer disease like COVID, right? So when COVID first came out, what did we hear about the symptoms? It was like the first hallmark that we heard.
It was like a cold.
Cold, right? So fever was high on the list, right? And then cold-like symptoms. But as it evolved, what did we notice or what did we learn?
People started saying there was a loss of taste and smell as well.
Good. What
And then
else?
also respiratory problems.
Respiratory issues. What else?
The cold and flu medicine that you would usually take like didn't have an effect on COVID.
Okay. So resistant common drugs to treat those symptoms. I think as we got more data, we also noticed that some people would test positive, and what were their symptoms?
Some people that tested positive wouldn't have symptoms at all.
Exactly, right? So we got tons of data from this. It started off and we're like, here's the symptom presentation. But much like any research, the more data you get, you adjust, right? That's kind of the laws of statistics. So now we are presented with a larger sample, which means a larger variety, more diverse sample size. And that informs us on the greater population, how might get affected. So, and I'm using COVID as an example because it's fairly new, right? And we have learned a lot in the last year as things, because I mean, it was right around this time that things were really more out of control in China and we're concerned about it coming to the US. So we get more data. But in order to know that data and to know how people are doing, you need to follow them and know the course of the disease, right? And for some, the course of the disease with COVID is it's a fatality. It's awful, right? And others, zero symptom, no fatality. So like, how does this happen? So going back to the Tuskegee study, there was a similar question, similar research question that was happening that they wanted to know what happens with syphilis. We see some where it's really bad, others that it's not so bad. Like, let's see what is the length or the result of this disease. So it came from a place of wanting to understand it better, the same way we do with COVID. The way they went about it was not the correct way. So they ended up having 600 African-American men join the study, 400 with syphilis, and they were not infected by researchers. So they had syphilis already. But the problem is they infected others knowingly to see what was going to happen. The researchers lied to them about what the course of the study was. They told them they had bad blood and that's why they were being treated for it. They intentionally chose a sector or a sample that was not going to question a medical authority in quite the same way as other sectors. So that specific group, and we'll watch a video in a minute, the literacy, ability, again, the amount of education they had was very limited. And so it felt like a very targeted group that the research were like, let's do it here because we're not going to get a lot of pushback. So right off the bat, what pops up for you guys? Good idea, bad idea, problematic or not? Like, what's an ethical issue that you're hearing right away?
Well, the first is that they're causing harm to the participants, which is supposed to be the number one basis for ethical research.
Yeah, the do no harm. Yes. So they are inserting an issue, right? Like, so yes, absolutely. They're doing harm. Are they picking a population that has the ability, or did they even try to seek out consent? And we'll see a little bit more about how messed up this actually is. Because not only did they not seek out consent, there was this implied, it was very coercive. They said, we will give you food, we will give you money if you participate. And if you're looking at a sample or a group of individuals that are struggling financially, they don't have enough food to eat, that becomes incredibly coercive because it's not really of their own free will that they're saying yes. They are just really needing whatever the carrot it is you're dangling. Okay, so several issues right there. They also were never given the approved treatment for syphilis. So at that point, penicillin had been introduced as an approved treatment. And because they wanted to see the course of the disease, they withheld the treatment. So again, the aspirational goal should be not only do no harm, but do good, like be benevolent. And so withholding a medicine that could help and manage their symptoms was something else that was wrong. The results were just atrocious, right? Dozens of people died. The disease was then spread to partners and to their children. There are cases of congenital syphilis in babies that were born from parents who had syphilis. So very much an issue. All right, so 3 major ethical violations that were found. So first, the participants were not treated with respect at all. They were never told that they had syphilis. They weren't informed about the cures that were available or treatments that were available. They felt coerced. I talked about this again because there was, that was the other piece they did. They provided a burial. They would cover the burial fee for family members who passed away, which is very expensive. And then, there was no informed consent. They just were like, let's participate in this. Now, second, the participants were actively harmed, right? So because they were not told about the penicillin as a treatment that could have cured those infected, right? That is hugely problematic. And many of the men in the study were not able to read. So again, we talked about literacy skills. They were not able to read to really understand what was going on as part of the treatment and had no knowledge that there was existing treatment. And then there's several of the men that underwent very painful and unnecessary medical treatments. So that's the other piece of it, right? So during the course, as the disease was spanning, some of them were curious as to whether the spinal fluid was in fact impacted by syphilis, which is again a research question, but to test it out, they did spinal taps, which is an incredibly painful medical procedure to see if there was any impact. And again, it was not medically indicated, right? The spinal tap did not provide a cure or aid in the symptoms in any way. It simply was out of curiosity. And the last ethical violation is the participants were a targeted, disadvantaged social group. They were poor and a minority, and we want to be respectful to all groups. And obviously there was none here. If again, you are looking, so for instance, if I'm looking at a disease that only impacts women, then in my research group, I'm only going to be targeting women. And it's not because I'm being prejudicial, it's because the course of the disease is only seen in one gender. That was not the case with syphilis. It impacted men and women of all socioeconomic group, of all racial background. So the fact that they targeted a poor and disadvantaged minority group was incredibly wrong. It did not match the goal of the study. Okay, so that's the Tuskegee study and some of the ethical concerns. Now, the Milgram obedience study. Anybody want to give me a quick snapshot of what that study is about? Or what do you remember from Psych 101? Whichever. Yeah, go ahead.
If I remember it correctly, weren't participants told to harm other participants, but they didn't know that they actually weren't harming, but it caused emotional distress in the people who were causing the harm?
Yes. Yep. Anybody else want to add to that? Okay, so that was pretty quick synopsis. So let's talk about this in a little bit deeper level. So participants were gathered and they were paired up with what they thought was another participant. Turns out it was not. It was a Confederate. They were part of the study. The goal of the study, as stated to the participants, was we are doing a study on learning and the impact of a negative stimulus in increasing learning. That was kind of the general piece. So they were given word pairs and they had to train. So the participant was training the Confederate, thinking it was also a participant, on these word pairs. So like apple, trousers, stapler, banana. I'm making stuff up, but like these nonsensical word pairs, right? And then every time the Confederate got an answer incorrect, a researcher in a lab coat standing next to the participant would say, administer the punishment, right? And so it was a machine and it showed the amount of shock that they had to give. And at first it was a quick buzz, but as it went on, and the goal was for the Confederate to fake like he was not getting any of them correct, to see how much pain would the participant inflict on the Confederate, like how far were they willing to go? And again, the level of coercion here was different than in the Tuskegee experiment. They weren't given an enormous amount of money. They weren't given food and they were starving. That was not the issue. They simply had a researcher in a lab coat standing next to the participant saying, administer the next, do it next, do the shock. That's all they said. Now, do you guys remember part of the reasons why Milgram's study, why they were curious about that?
He wanted to test the human ability to follow orders and how much they'll be obedient, even if they know that they're causing great harm to other humans. Because I think on the machine, it had levels. And at one point in the experiment, they told them to go to the highest level that said it could cause severe harm to the person. And multiple people did it for the experiment. And that was kind of the whole point, to see if people would be obedient to follow through with such egregious acts.
Exactly. And this was after, so this happened in the late 50s, early 60s. So we are post World War II, and social scientists are still reeling at all of the atrocities that have taken place in Nazi Germany and thinking, well, what is it about those people, right? People who followed orders from Hitler to do horrible things. Is there something unique about them? Or is this really an undercurrent of human nature? So the question of obedience was really a big one around that time, to try to figure out, in part, could this happen here? Or is this something that's, really idiosyncratic to that population in that time in a period of war? Hold on, I'm going to put my puppy out. You go out. Come back. So that was at the crux of what they were trying to figure out. What they did find out is, not too surprisingly, no, it's not unique to just Nazi Germany. It's happening here. Now, the question I always ask students is, do you think it is something unique of the 1960s and 50s that we wouldn't see today? Or do you think it could still happen today?
I think it does still happen today, and it's something that still can happen, because a lot of people like to compartmentalize and think that genocides and ethnic cleansings took place in the 20th century, when there are genocides happening to this day, such as in Myanmar. And there are still issues that people will follow through with orders. And I do think that study demonstrates that, but also it obviously wasn't warranted. But I think it goes to show, because even prior to the Holocaust, the United States had taken part in slavery and the genocide of Native Americans. So it's not really a question of whether they will follow orders, because we already see through history that people do follow orders, even in the US.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Yeah, I think oftentimes students will say, no, this wouldn't happen nowadays. Now, of course, a study has to be a little different, because we learned a lot about ethics in this study. But the truth is, they've replicated the Milgram's experiment multiple times, and the numbers don't lie. They keep repeating themselves. So this desire to be obedient to somebody who represents authority in one form or another is huge. So circling back on the wrap up for this experiment is, yes, every time they got it incorrect, they had to increase the shock, and the Confederate, right, the other participant, so to speak, would give verbal feedback as to the pain received, because it wasn't just a black box, because they thought, well, if you're just pressing a button but you don't know the impact, maybe that's not a big deal. But they were hearing the Confederate going, oh, that hurt, that hurt. Or later on, he was like, I have a heart condition. Please stop. Please don't do this. I'm in so much pain. And then crying and screaming. And at the end, no sound, perhaps implying that the participant had actually killed him. So, you know, this question there on my slide, is there a lasting psychological harm to a study like that, to somebody who is then debriefed after the study and says, just kidding, that guy was actually on our side. He's fine. He's fine. But let's talk about why you were okay torturing another human, right? Like, what is the psychological impact on the person who participated? It is pretty significant, right? And again, this type of study had to balance out, like, what are we benefiting? What are we learning from this study? And does that outweigh the risk or harm that we are putting on our participants? And again, this is a balance that is constantly being debated. So when I ask you guys, come up with a topic that feels safe, I'm balancing that out, right? I'm saying, please don't ask about trauma, because somebody who's responding to a questionnaire, that could be really traumatic and really reignite a lot of feelings. And we are, the benefit of our study is for learning. There is no greater societal benefit. So I do not want any participant to experience any level of harm, because that balance is really then not equal. Does that make sense? So this is something that as researchers, you continue to ask yourself in every study. So I think, let me see, there's a few more things here. 65%, this is kind of a fun stat, 65% of participants obeyed the experimenter and shocked the learners at the highest level. So 65%, it's quite high. Yeah, so that's high. All right, so let's watch this real quick. Hopefully this link is still gonna work. Okay, do you guys see it and hear it?
No.
You do not. I think it's because it's on my other screen. Let's see here, let's move that.
We hear it though.
You hear it, but you want to be able to see it. Do you see it now? It says Big History NL. Yes, okay. Let's do that.
Actually, we can't hear it right now. It's like muffled.
What is that, Mara?
It's like muffled a little bit.
It's muffled. It may just be the sound quality. Let's keep going.
We can't hear anything.
You can't hear anything. Oh, share sound. It was off.
The problem I wanted to study was a little different. It went a little bit further. It was the issue of authority. Under what conditions would a person obey authority who commanded actions that went against conscience? These are exactly the questions that I wanted to investigate at Yale University.
It is May 1962. An experiment is being conducted in the Elegant Interaction Laboratory at Yale University. The subjects are 40 males between the ages of 20 and 50 residing in the greater New Haven area.
Psychologists have developed several theories to explain how people learn. One theory is that people learn things correctly whenever they get punished for making a mistake.
40 years later, Milgram's infamous experiment, obedience, is still taught in classrooms around the world.
All right, teacher, would you take the test and be seated in front of the shock generator, please, in the next room?
But the experiment was rigged.
The victim was an accomplice of the experiment. The victim, according to plan, provided many wrong answers. His verbal responses were standardized on tape, and each protest was coordinated to a particular voltage level on the shock generator.
Now, as teacher, you were seated in front of this impressive-looking instrument, the shock generator.
Its essential feature is a line of switches that goes from 15 volts to 450 volts, and a set of verbal designations that goes from slight shock to moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, and finally XXX, danger severe shock. Your job, the experimenter explains to you, is a word pair test. If he gets each answer correctly, fine, you move on to the next pair. But if he makes a mistake, you are instructed to give him an electric shock, starting with 15 volts. And you increase the shock 1 step on each error.
Don't know what that says, but we're about to find out.
That is incorrect. This one will be 195 volts.
The learner was hidden from the teacher by a partition.
Of course, this was all a simulation. Nothing was really happening. But the learner made very convincing sounds of pain as the shocks increased.
This will be at 3:30.
And Milgram found, surprisingly and rather horrifyingly, that the majority of people would actually go right to the very highest level if there was some pressure from a man in a white coat who said things like,
It's absolutely essential that you continue. Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My eyes bother me.
Go on.
Let me out.
in fact, about 65% of the people who he studied, who were normal volunteers from the ordinary population, actually gave the maximum number of volts.
This man was one of those 65%.
This one will be 195 volts. The correct one.
Let me out of here.
Slow. Dance.
Let me out of here. My eyes bother me. Let me out of here. You have no right to keep me here. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out.
Continue, please.
Let me out of here. My eyes bother me. Let
Go
me
on.
out. Let me out.
Responsible for it. Red. That is incorrect. This will be at 3:30. The correct phrase is rich
Let me out of
boy.
here. Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let me out, I tell you. Let me out of here. Let me out of here. You have no right to hold me
The
here.
next phrase is
Let me
fast.
out. Let me out. Let me out. Let me out of here. Let me out. Let
Bird,
me out.
car, train, plane.
Eventually, the learner pretended to be unconscious.
Continue, teacher.
That is incorrect. This will be 3:45. The correct answer is fast bird.
What we learned from that experiment is that people will actually do an awful lot when they're put under pressure from authority figures. And the problem is, of course, that when we obey the unjust authority figure, the person who gives us immoral commands, then, of course, awful things can go wrong.
Okay. What are your thoughts?
That's pretty horrifying. Well, both like the study, like to be in it, and also the experiment results.
Yeah. Did you guys catch the participant said something, right? He was looking back to the authority, the researcher, and what did he say? Did you guys catch that? After the Confederate was like screaming and saying, "I'm in pain, let me out of here."
Did he say it's on you guys or
Yeah.
something like that?
You totally did. It's on you guys, it's your responsibility. So right there, that's the part where there's a separation between I am doing what I am told to do, despite me not wanting to, but I'm following orders. That's my job. That's what I got to do. And whatever horrific things may be happening, that is on a higher authority that's beyond like my pay scale, so to speak. Like that's not on me. So what happens there? There's a diffuse responsibility, right? You walk away and you're able to separate your actions from maybe any internal guilt you may be having, because that's not what you would choose to do, which is kind of problematic. Now, this has been shown in multiple studies. Have you guys heard about the Stanford prison experiment? Anybody?
Yeah, there's a movie on it too that I watched.
Is it a movie or a documentary, Eliza?
I think they have both. They have like a movie that has like actual actors that like actually go through what they would have done. It's pretty interesting.
Okay, I'm writing this down because that sounds like something I want to watch.
Yeah, I think it's called just like the Stanford Prison Experiment or something like that.
Okay, can you give us a quick synopsis of what they did in there, Eliza?
Yeah, they pretty much just had college students. They lured them in because they told them they would get paid. And they flipped a coin pretty much to determine if they were a prisoner or like an authority figure, like a police person, I guess, like a security
guard. Yep.
Yeah, guard. And they pretty much just gave them like no direction just to see what they would do. And the prisoners like had an uprising and they tried to go against the authority. And then I don't know, it was crazy.
It was crazy. So the big piece about that, well, several pieces that Eliza hit on correctly. It was completely randomized. People were randomly assigned to one group or the other. And that is key, right? Like for good experimentation, you don't want somebody who's kind of power hungry to be like, I'll be a guard, right? Or somebody who's meek to go, okay, I'll be, a prisoner. Randomly assigned. So you're kind of taking that piece away. And they were not given a whole lot of directions. They were just told, this is like a pretend prison in the like basement of the psych lab. And it was supposed to run for quite a long time. Do you remember how long it actually lasted though?
It was like only not even 2 weeks. Like it was maybe a few days.
Few days. Yes. It was supposed to be like a 6-week long experiment because they thought, well, surely it'll take a while for us to see any sort of behavior. And part of the question was, if given authority, how do people respond? And if put in a more submissive, subservient position, how do people respond? And the impact was significant. This is another one where the research question was interesting. And I think at first they were like, well, this will actually benefit our society greatly. Because if we can figure out, again, obedience pieces and social roles, social norms, but the impact, the psychological harm on the people who participated was quite high. I think there were folks who committed suicide later on, just not able to tolerate the awful things they did. Some of the guards, there was a complete like dehumanizing of the participants, the prisoners, so to speak. They started calling them numbers instead of their names. Like it just was shocking. So again, we don't go into it as much in this class. And that was a study that was not done that long ago. I want to say it was like mid to late 70s. So again, just to show this is not singular. I'm gonna get the other one. Go ahead, Greg.
The guy who conducted that experiment, I've heard his name around like psych stuff for a while. And I was wondering, like, he seems to be a relatively renowned guy, like seems to be relatively well known. And I was wondering, did he get into any trouble for this? Or
Phil Zimbardo?
Yeah.
So I don't think so, actually.
It seemed like that his career was totally fine. Like it seemed that his career was unimpacted. He had stuff that he did after this. He had stuff that he did before this, and it all seemed to be fine.
Yeah. In fact, Greg, I think it kind of propelled him into greater opportunities. The fact that he had this experiment that he was well known for.
So popular, so polarizing.
Yeah. Well, I think it lies in this unknown, right? So what went wrong? Lots went wrong, right? Ethically, but now he did ask them all to do consent. And once he did notice that there was significant harm, he shut it down, right? So that is the proper course of research, is in the face of new data, you adjust, right? And so seeing in this particular experiment, like, whoa, there is intense harm being done on the prisoners. There is likely going to be significant psychological harm done on the people who are acting as guards because of the awful things they're going through. We need to shut this down. That balance I was talking about earlier, it no longer outweighs, the benefits no longer outweigh whatever negative aspect may be coming from the study.
So he didn't necessarily do anything wrong. He just kind of stepped in an area that was
unknown.
Yeah.
Yep. Now, If Zimbardo had said, we are going to do another Milgram experiment, right? And we're going to run it the same, but instead of shocks, it's going to be, needle pokes, right? Well, no, we have already learned from this study that the impact is negative. Like, we know about obedience. We don't need to be asking that question anymore. That would have been faulty research. He would have gotten in trouble for that. But because this was a total separate experiment, randomizing if given authority, that's why I think that was not as much of an impact.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, no, but it's a good question. Okay. Whoops, I just lost my screen. There we go. All right. So from these studies developed this core standards, like these ethical principles, because we were noticing as a field of social science, there is a problem here. We need to come up with some basic rules that will govern all research that takes place with human participants. So the Belmont report first came out, and the goal again was threefold. One, there's a principle for respect of persons, and part of getting that respect is to actually get informed consent from participants. So they should be free to decide one way or other whether they want to participate in this study. And that should not be done in a coercive manner. So it is not uncommon for research studies to offer some sort of reward or benefit, but the reward cannot be so high as it becomes coercive to a participant. So it's finding that balance as well. Let's see. Within this issue of respect of person, there's also the issue of which groups are able to give consent and which are not. Okay, come. Sorry, I've got a dog who keeps going on our pond, and it's frozen solid, but kind of don't want to have to rush out in case it's not. So you need to be thoughtful about that. Now, what are groups that would require a little bit more attention and protection in regards to informed consent?
Young adults or children.
Absolutely. Young adults and children. Are they actually able to understand what they're participating in? Are they able to give consent or not? Right? What would be another? What do we think? What's another group that would be protected? How about people with cognitive disabilities that are maybe not able to read, not able to grasp the potential harm that is facing them, right? And lastly, it would be prisoners. So prisoners are not, again, you may see them as not having granted any sort of freedom, but that is not true. They are still a protected class. You cannot have them do anything you want because they're a captive audience, so to speak. So the issue of informed consent needs to be provided for all of these protected classes. So usually you need a verbal assent from those protected classes that they're okay participating, and you need a grantor, or person in charge of them, guardian, to give informed consent. So both need to be present. Okay, the second principle is the principle of beneficence. So that you are trying to do good. The goal of your study is to promote good, and inherently within that, to do no harm, okay? That is the balance that we've been talking about that needs to be weighed. So you need to weigh the risk and benefits of any study, and any impact that is negative on the participant needs to greatly be outweighed by the positive that may be coming to society at large, the general population, by doing this study. Okay, so again, this was clearly violated in the Tuskegee syphilis experiment because there was great harm put on them, and there was really no benefit because there was already a cure. We already knew that penicillin did the trick. So this is one of those that doesn't line up at all. The last one is the principle of justice. So it's the question of who is this research actually going to benefit, and is it representative of all people, right? So if you've got a particular disease or symptom that only impacts a very, very, very small, minute group, and you do a research on a massive group that's overly broad, That's not very just, especially if there's going to be any harm that they encounter. So, you're trying to see who's going to bear both the risk and benefits, and that should be fairly equal. Okay, so protecting vulnerable research population, that is a main goal of us, of our group, social scientists, right? Think about, for instance, again, I'm using COVID because it's most recent. Like, how many parents are like, yep, give my kid a COVID vaccine to be part of a research trial? How often does that happen, you think? Or cancer treatment. Oh, this worked with adults? Sure, test it on my kid. Usually not, right? Usually parents are very protective and want to make sure they keep them safe. So we need to be very careful when there's any research that's being done on protected classes. So one of the ways that we've created these safeguards to make sure that people are staying safe and that we are following ethical principle is to do an institutional review board. Now, for the purpose of our class and our research assignment, we are not going to go through IRB, in part because that process alone takes 2 weeks to 4 weeks. There's just not enough time in the course of a class. So that's why one of the lines in the informed consent that we will have is that this is solely for the purpose of a class, and there is no mandatory participation. People can certainly back out and not participate if they don't want to. So the aim, again, is to protect human research participants from harm. So in an IRB, or institutional review board protocol, you have to include, it's usually a form that you fill in. One of them is you need to provide a copy of your informed consent so that the board can see how you're relating to the participant, what the study is about. It is then reviewed by the IRE board, which is usually made up of faculty members within the university, but from different disciplines. And again, it requires to have at least 5 members, at least one must be a scientist, and at least one must be a non-scientist. That's to get the balanced view as to what a study is about. And then the goal of the IRB board is to determine if the research is actually ethical and if it can be conducted. If not, the protocol could just be rejected and the researcher is not allowed to conduct the research. Occasionally, you can have a rewrite or some edits being done on your research protocol to make it safer. They'll at times even do tweaks on your informed consent so it's more clear. If you go through and do an informed consent, you need to highlight your entire letter to see what is the reading level of your letter. Do you guys know how to do that in Word? You can see like what is the reading level based on the language you're using and how complex and long your sentences are. And you're really aiming for no greater than 8th grade to make sure that everyone understands what you're telling them and that they can adequately provide informed consent. Okay. Now, specifically for psychologists and folks doing psychological research, the APA came out with a revised guideline in 2016. And again, this needs to be followed by any student, researcher, clinician, teacher, anybody who is involved in any level of research, and it includes those 3 core benefits that we talked about. Okay, now, ethical violations. We've talked about, obviously, do no harm. You're trying to protect your participants, showing them respect, this idea of justice. So that is obviously a main goal, like those are ethical core rules, but there's other types of ethical violation, right? So faking or falsifying data would also be a breach of ethics. Why is that?
Because not only are you misleading the subjects who participate in the study, but you're also misleading people who may use your work for any means. And if you're giving infactual information, it could impact other people and even cause harm depending on what kind of study you are trying to falsify.
Absolutely. So it's multi-layered, right? So not only is it unethical because as a person, you shouldn't lie, right? So like basic human decency, don't lie. Second layer is it could negatively impact further, participants. You could be lying about the impact on them already. And the third layer is in your own academic community. If somebody is taking this as a seminal article and they're like, well, I'm going to do this because Joe Schmo said that this was true, that is furthering the falsification and quite likely could do harm on participants later on. Or again, this balance we're trying to do, does the good outweigh the bad? If you're faking the good here, that's a problem. So as a research group and community, we must follow ethical guidelines for our participants, but also within our community, right? Like as ourselves. So falsifying and faking results is just simply not allowed. Not okay. That shouldn't come as a surprise, right? Don't lie, right? Okay. So there's 5 general ethical principles here based on the Belmont report. We got beneficence and non-maleficence. So trusting, treat people in ways that benefit them and do not cause them harm or suffering. Again, this idea of fidelity and responsibility, that's to establish relationships of trust and accept responsibility for professional behavior. And then integrity, strive to be accurate, truthful, and honest in your role as a researcher, teacher, and practitioner. So this beneficence really encompasses all of that. So it goes from the Belmont report, as you can see, the 3 main core ethical guidelines, and then we're developed into these 5 ethical principles of the APA. The last 2 really are the same. So again, justice is striving to treat all groups of people fairly. And then respect of people's rights is to recognize that people are autonomous agents and we have to protect people's rights, including the right to privacy, the right to give consent for treatment, and the right to have participation treated confidentially. Goodness gracious, I couldn't get that word out. Okay. Does this make sense? Okay. There's 10 specific ethical standards in the APA. And you can see here, I showed you what they are. I'm not the kind of professor who's going to say, what is standard 8.08? No, we're not doing that. But this is basically what we covered in terms of institutional review board. What is informed consent? Now there's a whole piece on deception. Is it okay to be deceitful in a study? What do we think?
I think yes, to a degree, because like you don't want them to know what the study's about because that could influence how the results are. Because like they might try to be one way or the other,
Right. So I love that you said to a degree, right? So it's like a yes with an asterisk. Kind of depends on the case, right? So absolutely. There are times where, so for instance, I don't know why that's where my mind went, but let's go with it. I used to work back in when I lived in California in forensic psychology. So I worked in a lot of the state hospitals, and for sex offenders, you're trying to figure out if there's been rehabilitation, right? And so one of the tests would be look through these photos, right? And then say if you're attracted or if you have any level of arousal to the photos. And so now think that through. Somebody I'm not even going to say what, but let's say they're in for some sort of sex offense. What might their motivation be in saying whether they're sexually aroused to a picture, yes or no?
to get out of jail or prison or whatever.
So are they more likely to say, yes, this thing I'm not supposed to be attracted to? I'm going to say yes. I'm going to be honest. No, right? No, again, human nature is, I know this is not okay. This is why I'm here. I've been incarcerated. So if you're going to give me this test, I'm going to say no. Now, is the test actually just calculating what they said yes or no to? No, there's a level of deception there because it's calculating how many seconds they look at a picture. And the longer they look at a certain picture, that actually speaks to what they're more aroused or interested in. Okay. So now that's a psychological instrument. It's not quite research in quite the same way, but there is a certain level of deception there that is inherent, because if we didn't use other methods, if we didn't have validity measures like that, there are several behaviors that we would never be able to adequately and accurately measure, because social rules bind us that like we don't want to admit to fault, right? Okay. So deception, there's two different types. So you can have a deception by omission. You just don't mention something totally, so you're withholding details. Or you can have deception by commission, right? Commission. You are adding in detail. You are actively lying to participants in some fashion. That can be done if you have adequate debriefing. So that's the next standard. Debriefing is sitting down with your participant and telling them about the study. Like, what was this actually about? What did we find out? Why did we do this? They're usually done verbally, and they explain why deception was used and the nature of the deception, okay? Research misconduct, something you can very much get in trouble for, includes data fabrication and data falsification and plagiarism. Again, these shouldn't be no shockers. Like, ethically, to be adequate researchers, we're not going to make up data, we're not going to lie about the data, we're not going to steal someone's data. And then in terms of animal research in the social sciences, there is in fact a space there to do animal research. What's the first thing that comes to mind? What animal, what might we use?
Rats.
Mm-hmm. Like what? So rats, what do you imagine? And to me, it's like,
I imagine Pavlov and the experiments with like bells and such.
Yeah. So Pavlov, Watson, Skinner, all of those behaviorists who used rats to figure out mazes, to learn, what is learning looking like. So absolutely, there's a space for animal research to be present. But again, whenever you're utilizing animal research, you need to make sure that they are well treated. And again, whatever risk they may get is greatly outweighed by whatever benefit you're reaping from the study. So those same standards extend to animal research as well. Okay, well, going in a little bit more deeply here. There is legal protection for laboratory animals. They need to be cared for properly. And you need to be mindful of the 3 R's, which is replacement, refinement, and reduction. Replacement is finding alternatives to using animals whenever possible. And actually, we have lots of options now, which is why in psych departments, there's fewer and fewer animal labs, because we have computer models that can act very similar as animals. So if you're able to replace away from a live creature to an animal, to a computer model, you should do that. Refinement is how could the research procedures and aspects of animal care can be altered to reduce animal distress. So again, refine your procedures so that we are causing the least amount of harm onto the animal. And third is reduction, which is we're trying to use the fewest animals as possible. So whereas with human research, if you're having them fill out a questionnaire, you're like, I want to get 500. What's the largest number I can get? That's my goal. With animals, you really want to see what is the effect size that I need. I need the smallest number so that I don't create harm on those and reduce the stress as much as possible. What do you guys think are attitudes towards scientists and students who use animals? What's the general sense out there that you get?
I feel like it's better that it's an animal than a human. Is probably the attitudes. Like, well, we're gonna do this on rats so that we don't have to do it on humans.
Mm-hmm. I think that's definitely one viewpoint. Yep. Were you gonna say something too, Samuel?
Yeah, I was going to say I'm not as well versed about animal experiments taking place like in present day, but a lot of the experiments that I know of from the past tended to do harm to them, which is kind of why there is this sentiment that we shouldn't use animals as much because they aren't able to give any form of consent. So a lot of people, especially would say animals should not be used.
Yeah, I think you guys represented exactly the two attitudes that exist. Better an animal than a human, because if something goes wrong, there's slightly, ease and replacement than with a human life. But there's the other sense of they can't give consent. Are we using animals in ways that's actually really unethical because no one's protecting them, right? So that's how that's constantly balanced. There's definitely strong attitudes about animal rights groups. You mentioned PETA, they're active. I think like in the 90s and early 2000, that was far more of a movement. And that led to good reform as well. That, this idea of reduction, let's not use 100 monkeys, right? Like in some biomedical research, if we could just use 5 and still get some significance, right? So just being choosy. So good things have come out of that, but there's definitely strong attitudes on both sides. Okay. Again, this is something we need to keep thinking about because it is not clear cut. It just isn't. So when I ask you guys to think like philosophically, are you okay doing harm to a small group of people, which will then give a benefit to a much larger group of people? That's a tough decision, especially if you're participating in actively part of what's causing some level of risk, right? So it is a constant and never-ending balance. The questions should never end as to, is this a good research? Is this something that's going to be helpful? And it's in ways that you guys may, like right now, it seems so clear, like don't cause psychological harm, right? Prison experiment, Milgram, bad. Tuskegee syphilis experiment, very bad. Don't do that. Everything else nowadays is fine. But even on smaller scale, you see it. I had a student for the dissertation, they wanted to look at leadership groups, right? You think leadership, sure, that's a great idea. And so he picked 3 different big corporations and had managers, supervisors, directors, and general employees answer these surveys. And then the directors, the higher ups, were going to see the results. Any problems that pop up for that? What do you guys think?
Yeah, because you could be doing harm or to the well-being of the participants because their supervisors could take action against them, whether it be like firing them or pejorative action. So it probably
100%. Yeah. And my student was like, but it's anonymous. And I was like, okay, so how many people, like, he's like, well, there's 5 in this group. And I'm like, usually 5 people, you're going to know, especially if there's any open-ended question, you're going to just know. So we got to be careful. We got to be protective so that they feel confident, because 2 things will happen. Either they'll be super honest and there could be retribution from the higher ups if there's anything negative stated about the company. Or what's the alternative? The participants realizes, eek, this is not safe. And then what kind of data are they going to give you? It's not going to be meaningful because it's probably going to be a lie or minimization of how they're feeling. At which point my question is this worthy research? If you are not going to get an accurate picture, I would say it's not. So you need to provide an environment where the participants are going to be free to respond in the most meaningful way so that you can get the greatest benefit out of the research by also minimizing the risk. So again, it's a constant battle between the 2. All right, let's finish that. Let's see here. Where is my other slide? Whoops. You guys disappeared on me. There you are. Okay. How much time do we have? Does class end at 10:30 or 10:40? It doesn't end at 10 though, right? Okay. All right. Glad I'm not seeing people going, why are we still here? Okay. I wanted to show you this, but oh, no, thank you. Thank you guys for the grace with my crazy dogs who are loud and bark. Okay, give me 1 second. I just want to copy this link. I don't know that I can. Let's see. How long is? Oh, yeah. You know what I did, you guys? I linked the ad from Facebook. Let me quickly find it because I want us to talk a little bit more about the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. But we need to be just thoughtful on how much time we have. Okay. So I want to point you in a couple directions so that you guys can. Oh, little Albert. Did you just ask about that? Yeah. No, not ethical. Okay, so do you guys remember the experiment? Was that Watson? I think it might have been Watson. Children experiment about fear and fear response and whether you could create a conditional response if you just showed, I think it was a bunny, and see the fear response in the child. Is this ringing a bell for people? Did you guys learn that in learning and motivation or something like that?
Yeah.
Okay, so the fact that it was done on a child, that's the first ethical concern. Second, what might be the long-lasting impact on that child? I would say probably fairly bad, right? Maybe you have a deep-seated fear of anything white and furry for the rest of your life, which maybe you're like, that's not the worst thing in the world, but that's also not great. And I wonder what would have been a substitute to learn about conditional fear response. I think there could have been others, maybe with an adult and maybe with something less fearful, right? Where you could have just paired it and then done a measurement on physiological fear response. Because what is a physiological fear response? You might start sweating, your increased heart rate, right? Okay, so you can measure that without like causing trauma, but good question. Okay, so I want to share this real quick here. We don't have time to watch it, but this is excellent and talks about the entire Tuskegee syphilis experiment. It's over an hour. So we're going to go for the smaller one here, which I think actually. Can you see it?
Owen Garrick, and I'm a physician here in the Oakland community, and I do clinical research.
My name is Marcella Alshon. I'm an assistant professor at CHP PCOR, and I have a background in both medicine and economics.
I'm Javarsi. I'm a sophomore here at Stanford. Most likely majoring in biology, but currently expecting to go to med school.
We started a pilot study, which is examining some of the factors that get Black men in particular to seek preventative health care.
This notion that trust is important, trust in institutions is very important. I think that's very relevant, and it takes a long time to build it back up.
One of the big factors are historical abuses. And the most well-known and probably the most egregious historical abuse is the U.S. Public Health Service study of syphilis around Tuskegee, Alabama.
And what had happened was for 4 decades from 1932 to 1972, they specifically targeted Black men in the South who had very little education and followed them even though they had a treatment for syphilis and watched them as the disease progressed.
One of the big things I remember always being emphasized growing up is the huge gap in life expectancies between African American populations and Caucasian populations, specifically between white and Black men.
It had been written about for a long time that might have actually had an effect on the trust that particularly those men had in the institutions of public health, in medicine. We just took that hypothesis seriously, and we dug around, myself and my co-author, Marianne Wanamaker from the University of Tennessee, to actually see if that hypothesis held water. And we found that it did.
So those are some of the things we're trying to determine. What are the real factors behind African American male mistrust or distrust of the healthcare system? So we first started working in barbershops, and we went to barbershops to recruit Black men. If you know anything about the Black barbershop, everyone, if you need to get your hair cut and you're a Black guy, whether you're rich or poor, or PhD, or didn't finish high school, you go to the same barbershop that is part of your community.
I think as the Black Barbershop, we're somewhat looked to as the pillar of the community. So we take on the responsibility of helping the Black man's well-being.
I would definitely say I love my experience in the barbershop. I think one thing that I really got a feel for is like the many facets of the communities, specifically the even African American male communities within Oakland.
One thing we learned was just how much weight the Stanford brand has, and how I think happy people were that we were interested and involved with their struggles.
We have limited access to healthcare opportunities.
We would really leave this kind of bubble that we're in and really go down and see some of the challenges people were facing financially, economically, socially.
Me personally, I've had bad experiences with the medical system, with the criminal justice system. So a few years ago, I was shot, and I wasn't necessarily treated the way that I would have liked, right? And one thing that I noticed and one thing that I didn't see is people that look like me, and which instantly put me in a state of vulnerability.
Because a lot of minorities, they don't seek health care for many reasons, whether they're scared and they just don't know. But with me being in the face of the shops, recruiting is kind of like, oh, hey, this guy, you know, it's just kind of like, it's a connection.
This is a bigger problem than just in my community, because throughout this research project, we were able to meet folks from Africa, we were able to meet folks from different states, and it's a common problem throughout this nation, right, throughout the world.
So Dr. Alston and I hope to uncover a few things. One, what are some of the factors that either get Black men to seek preventative health care, or to prevent them from seeking preventative health care? So if we know that, if we look at the positive side, we can maybe impact policy or work with institutions like a Stanford or a Sutter Health to design systems that reinforce some of those positive aspects.
Okay. And as I mentioned, this is an ongoing issue, right? Like they found numbers in, again, further south that Black men were not wanting to get the COVID vaccine when offered to them. Now, there's a lot of people in this country that don't want the vaccine, so I'm not saying that's singular to them, but the impact of the medical mistrust by medical authorities and white medical authorities has had a huge negative impact. And so again, the ethics of that one study have trickled over, here we are almost 100 years later, since it started in the 30s, and it's very significant. Any thoughts on that? It's a weird space to end the class. Thoughts on racism and bad medical ethical choices? Well, it's just sad. I would encourage you guys, if you have some time, to watch that hour-long documentary. It actually walks through several of the things that were done that we didn't dig into as much detail. Your textbook has a lot of good examples as well that you can look through. So for next class, let's make sure we're all on the same page here as to what we're doing. Where's our syllabus? Here it is. I need to make sure that everyone has had a topic turned in by Friday. So make sure that you work on that and write it out on the choose your topic discussion board. We need to make sure that that gets all wrapped up. We are Friday going to be talking about the literature review and how we will format references, because you need to start working on that in subsequent weeks, and we'll go from there. Any questions? Okay, I will see you all on Friday then. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks.